All right, so you're ready for game 4, Phillies versus Mets, and you really want to get past those surface level takes, right? We're talking deep, deep dive into this matchup based on these articles you sent
We're
over.
going to break down everything.
Yeah.
The pitching, the odds, those key stats for both teams.
Yeah.
You'll be the most knowledgeable fan at your watch party.
Love it. Just to get us started, the game is Wednesday, October 9th, 5:08 p.m. Eastern. We're at Citi Field in New York, and if you're stuck at home, turn on FS1.
The pressure is on because the Mets are up 2-1 in the series, one more win, and they're off to the NLCS.
No doubt about it, the tension is high. So let's talk about the pitching matchup. It's Ranger Suarez for the Phillies, and he's going up against the Mets' Jose Quintana. One of the articles you sent mentions Suarez has a 1.62 ERA in 9 playoff games.
He's incredible in the playoffs. Really steps up under pressure, but, and this is a big but, he really struggled at the end of the regular season. Kind of limped into the playoffs.
Right, his ERA in September wasn't pretty, so which Suarez will we see tonight?
That's the big question, isn't it? The other thing is that he hasn't pitched in a while. One of the articles you sent over pointed out that his ERA jumps up to .750 after 6 or more days of rest, and he's had a long layoff.
Interesting, so that's something to keep an eye on for sure. Okay, let's talk about Quintana. He's coming off that shutout against the Brewers in the wildcard game. 6 strong innings.
Yeah, he looked really sharp in that game. But one of the articles highlighted his history against the Phillies specifically. A 3.53 ERA over 12 starts. Not terrible, but not dominant. And it gets interesting because when you dig a little deeper, you can see that he tends to struggle against the right-handed hitters.
Okay, so advantage Phillies there.
Potentially, yeah. Especially guys like Harper and Castellanos. If they have a good night, Quintana could be in trouble.
Okay, so we've got a seasoned playoff pitcher who might be a little rusty and a hot pitcher who might have a weakness we can exploit. Before we get into the teams themselves, you mentioned betting odds. What are we looking at?
Yeah, so BetMGM has the Mets as the underdog, but only slightly, at Nagish 105 on the money line. Phillies are Nagish 115. The over-under for total runs is set at 7.5.
So the odds makers are leaning toward the Phillies just a bit. Do the trends you dug up support that?
One trend really jumped out. The Phillies have gone over 7.5 runs in 7 of their last 9 games against the Mets. So we might be in for a high-scoring game even with 2 good pitchers starting.
Okay, so buckle up. It could be a shootout. What else did you learn about these two teams?
One thing that can't be ignored is home field advantage, which definitely favors the Mets. They've been really tough to beat at Citi Field. One of these articles mentioned that they've won 4 of their last 5 against division rivals at home.
Home crowd, momentum, all that good stuff. How did the Phillies counter that?
They match up really well against left-handed pitching, which is what they're facing tonight with Quintana. Their WRC plus, one of those advanced hitting metrics, is the 3rd best in all of baseball against lefties.
And just to remind everyone, WRC Plus measures a team's offensive performance, taking all sorts of factors into account, and 100 is considered average. So 118 is impressive.
Very impressive, especially when you consider Quintana's go-to pitches are a fastball and a sinker, both averaging under 91 miles an hour this season.
So advantage Phillies.
The numbers seem to think so. They feast on those slower pitches. In fact, their XWOBA, which measures how often a team gets on base and how valuable those times on base are, is .406 against those slower pitches. That's really good.
Okay, so we're seeing a trend here. Anything else?
One more thing. They've hit 25 barrels, and a barrel is just a really gull-hit ball, by the way, against those slower pitches from Quintana.
Wow.
Yeah, most in baseball, which tells you this could be a big problem for Quintana.
All right, so we've got some really interesting offensive potential for the Phillies. What about the Mets? How does their pitching stack up, especially against this Phillies lineup?
Well, putting Quintana aside for a second, the Mets have a well-rested bullpen, which could play a big factor. They haven't played a game since Sunday, so those relievers will be ready to go.
Especially with the Phillies facing elimination, you know they're going to be swinging for the fences, trying to make something happen.
Exactly, and that could mean trouble for the Mets if Quintana can't go deep into the game. And while their bullpen has been good overall, they've had their share of struggles lately. Their location plus rating, which basically measures how well they hit their spots, was the 2nd worst in the league down the stretch.
So some control issues potentially popping up at the worst time.
Potentially. And the Phillies are not a team you want to give extra chances to.
Now, before we go any further, let's define location plus for those who might not be familiar with it.
Basically, it tells you how often a pitcher can throw a strike when they need to.
And the Phillies, as you were saying, they've shown they can capitalize on the stakes.
They were a top 5 team in something called xFIP this season, which basically tells you that their pitching was really good at preventing runs.
XFIP, just to clarify, is expected fielding independent pitching, and it focuses on the things a pitcher can control, like strikeouts, walks, and home runs.
Exactly. It helps you understand how good a pitcher really is, even if they have a bad defense behind them. And the Phillies were really good.
Okay, so we've got pitching, we've got hitting, we've got all these stats and trends. What about those less tangible factors? Things like momentum, the pressure of elimination. How do those play into tonight's game?
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. The Mets have all the momentum right now. They're at home, they're up 2-1 in the series, they're one win away from moving on. But the Phillies, they're a tough team to count out. They've been in these spots before, and I don't think they're just going to roll over.
Right. Will they come out loose and relaxed, or will they press a little? One thing we haven't really touched on yet is how each team has responded in those key moments, those clutch situations. Did the articles mention anything about that? So we've talked about those moments when the game is on the line, those real pressure situations. What did the articles say about how each team handles those?
Yeah, the Mets have really stepped up in those clutch moments, especially in the 2 games they won. They've been fantastic with runners in scoring position, 7 for 15 in those situations.
So they're coming through when it matters most, big hits in those key situations. What about the Phillies? Have they been able to match that?
It's been a bit of a different story for them. They've had some chances, but they've also struggled to get that big hit when they need it. They've left a bunch of runners stranded in scoring position, and that's really hurt them.
Okay, so a little bit of a tale of two teams there. Now, going back to what we were talking about earlier, the Phillies' performance against left-handed pitching has been really impressive all season. It wasn't just a fluke. They've consistently hit lefties well, and you have to think that bodes well for them tonight against Quintana.
No question. That's a great point. We talked about their WRC plus against lefties earlier, but I think it's worth really breaking that down a bit. What does that stat actually tell us?
It's weighted runs created plus, right? And it
Right.
basically tells you how good a team is offensively, taking all sorts of things into account.
Yeah, exactly. Park effects, league averages, all that stuff. And a WRC plus of 100 is average, so anything above that is above average.
And I think you said the Phillies are at 118.
That's right, 118, which is really good. And to take it a step further, against those slower pitches we were talking about, Quintana's fastball and sinker, they have a .406 xWOBA.
Okay, so XWOBA, another one of those stats that might sound like gibberish to some people. You want to explain that one?
Sure, it stands for expected weighted on-base average. And it essentially tells you how often a team gets on base and how valuable those times on base are based on how well they're hitting the ball. It takes luck and defense out of it.
So a .406 XWOBA against those slower pitches, that means the Phillies are making solid contact when Quintana throws those pitches.
Yes, exactly. And we're not just talking about singles and walks here. They've hit 25 barrels, which are those really well-hit balls, off those pitches.
25.
25, most in baseball, which tells you that Quintana might be in trouble tonight.
That's a great point, and it kind of underscores what we were talking about before, looking beyond those basic stats. Quintana might have a decent ERA against the Phillies overall, but when you really start to dig into the numbers, it reveals a potential weakness. Now, switching gears to the other side, what about the Mets pitching and how they match up against this Phillies lineup? What were some of the key takeaways from the articles there?
Well, I think the big thing for the Mets is their bullpen. They haven't played a game since Sunday, so all those relievers will be well rested. That's a good point.
Yeah, and that could be huge because if Quintana struggles, especially early on, and he can't go deep into the game, the Mets are going to have to rely on that bullpen more. And while they've been pretty solid for the most part this season, their location plus rating, which essentially measures how well they can throw strikes consistently, was really bad down the stretch.
You want to remind everyone what location plus is?
Sure, it's essentially a measure of how often a pitcher throws a strike when he needs to.
And the Phillies, they've shown they can make you pay if you make mistakes.
That's right. They were a top 5 team in something called xFIP this season, which essentially tells you that they were really good at preventing runs.
And CAXFIP is expected fielding independent pitching.
Exactly. It isolates the things a pitcher has control over. It takes their defense out of the equation. Okay, so we've got these fascinating pitching storylines. We've talked about offensive strengths and weaknesses on both sides, but what about that it factor? The things you can't really quantify. Momentum, the pressure of being on the brink of elimination. How do those things play into this game? What did the articles have to say about that?
It's really interesting when you look at those more intangible factors like momentum. That's where the Mets have really had the edge. They've been winning those close games, coming up clutch when they needed to.
What stood out to you about their performance in those big moments?
Well, and those 2 wins they've had so far this series, they've been really good with runners in scoring position, like 7 for 15
Yeah.
in those situations. So they're not just getting hits, they're getting those timely hits.
Yeah, those are the ones that matter most, especially this time of year. What about the Phillies? How have they handled those high-pressure situations?
They've had their moments, but they haven't been as consistent. They've had a lot of runners on base, but they haven't been able to drive those runs in as consistently. One article even pointed out that they were the worst team in baseball with runners in scoring position during September.
That's not what you want to see heading into the playoffs.
Definitely not. And I think some of that pressure might be getting to them, especially with those 2 big bats, Real Muto and Bohm, really struggling to get anything going.
Yeah, they've been quiet, and they need those guys to produce if they want to extend this series. The Mets, on the other hand, they've really been clicking offensively, even if Alonso hasn't had a ton of hits.
Right. They've been getting contributions up and down the lineup, which is a great sign for them.
It takes the pressure off.
Exactly. Nobody has to be the hero every single night.
So we've covered a lot. The pitching matchup, those key stats and trends we pulled from the articles, even the mental side of this game. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they get ready for Game 4?
Yeah, this game could really go either way. 2 teams with a ton at stake, and both think they can win. Just a ton of pressure on both sides.
Which makes it fun for us.
The best kind of game to watch. And, it's tough to predict baseball, but one thing I'll be keeping an eye on is the wind.
The wind. Okay.
Yeah. Citi Field can be a little weird with the wind. Some days it's a factor, some days it's not. If it's swirling around, that could change how these pitchers approach things.
Fascinating. I love it. Little weather strategy. I'm sure our listeners appreciate that.
Absolutely.
All right. So we've got a potential pitcher's duel. We've got 2 teams fighting for their playoff lives, and we've got the unpredictable winds of Citi Field. I don't know about you, but I am ready for this one. Enjoy the game.
You'll never have me, sacred stone.
Oh, this you crazy mother.